pretty wide scope. And so we have a number of speakers in this panel, so I'm going to try to restrict my comments just to the question of the relationship between economic crisis, in particular the current economic crisis, and the question of militarization and war. Make some kind of introductory remarks that I'm sure the other panelists and the discussion in general will help to amplify. Gil Scott-Heron is one of my favorite Afro-American poets of the last 30 years or more. He's still very active and still continues to perform. I guess in modern terms we would say he's a spoken word artist. And many of you are familiar with him. If you're not, I suggest you Google him on YouTube and listen to some of his poems and music and so on. Anyway, many years ago, sometime back in the late 70s, early 80s, in one of his recorded performances, he does a rap or a rant, or what in Quebec we would call a monologue, a monologuiste. And well, he's talking about the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, maybe also the attack, the brutal repression of the riots at Ithaca and so on. He's talking about some of these developments, and in the course of it he says, and once again America is in shock. America leads the world in terms of shock. Unfortunately, America does not lead the world in deciphering the causes of shocks. Well, I don't think it's something particular or unique about Americans. I think it's I think it applies elsewhere as well. But the point I guess he's getting at is to understand the causal relations between the developments politically and developments economically, nationally and internationally, and what is the interrelationship here. And obviously this is an important question with respect to the issue of war and peace in particular. Now, our own tradition in the World Peace Council movement has always and continues to have an understanding that war, militarization, the drive for aggression and war is an inherent feature of the socio-economic system we live in, of capitalism. That it's a built-in feature. It's not just something that happens in tandem or coincidentally with respect to economic relations, but in fact is connected directly to the struggle for markets, for resources, for plunder. But obviously we need to go further than that. We can say that to ourselves and we understand that. But this understanding is growing amongst broader circles and sections of the peace movement. I think of my own brother, who is not a very political person at all, a working class guy, lives in San Diego, California. He even voted for Bush in the first election. He voted for Bush in the second election. 3 years into Bush's second term, he decided that he was the devil incarnate and had to be driven from office. But he understood, starting to understand the relationship between the war in Iraq and the economic interests of Halliburton and so on and so forth, Cheney and all of these forces that have been profiting as a result of this war. And so in many respects, and I think back to the peace movement in the early 80s, when I was very involved in Vancouver during that period of the Reagan administration and the resurgence in the arms race, there was all sorts of people in the peace movement, from faith communities and different professional organizations and so on, that were concerned about the question of survival and preventing nuclear war and fighting against the arms race. But in terms of their understanding of the relationship between militarization and economic issues, was not so advanced. And I think in many respects there is much more understanding today. But I think that this is one area in particular where the most advanced sections of the peace movement, the most anti-imperialist section of the peace movement, represented by the World Peace Council and its affiliates, can make a very important contribution. I just want to talk very briefly about this causal relationship, because often we tend to think that war is the result of this economic system, which after all is based on greed and avarice and expansion and conquest. But I think that in the current circumstance of this global economic crisis, it's important to understand that militarization and war is not just a result of the dynamics economically, but in many respects has also contributed to the deepening of the economic crisis. And I want to talk about both sides of that question, if I will. First of all, militarization, and there's no better example than looking at the US economy, precisely because of the massive objective size of arms spending in the United States. It was referred to yesterday, amounting to almost, if not over 50% of all of the arms spending in the world is based in the United States, and has an incredibly bloated military budget. That militarization in general is one of the mechanisms of transferring wealth by the state from working people to the corporations and the ruling class in general. Now we understand that the tax system as a whole is a means to transfer wealth, or transfer more wealth. A lot of that wealth is transferred right in the process of production itself, right in the workplace. But also in terms of public policy, state policy, the tax system is a way of transferring wealth to the rich. And all those tax cuts to the corporations and the wealthy is basically not coming from, dropping from the sky, but in fact a reflection of this transfer of wealth. And it's precisely the relative impoverishment of working people, who after all are also the consumers, the end consumers of the goods and services that are produced in an economy, that accentuates, that increases and exacerbates this contradiction that exists within the capitalist system, namely that its very success in producing wealth and transferring that wealth and expropriating that wealth from one class to the ownership class, which lays the basis for periodic economic crises. Because you have relative overproduction. There's more goods and services being produced than people can afford to buy. Why? Because their wages have been held down, because their taxes have been driven up, because they have less disposable income. They're forced into debt, and eventually the debt bubble bursts, and you have these periodic economic crises.